Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Joseph Wright. Now, Joseph is a political scientist at Pennsylvania State University who has spent a considerable amount of his academic life researching at a very fundamental level the nature and the breakdown of autocratic regimes, why they rise, why they sustain, and why they fall. And a lot of his work does this through the collection and the comparison between deep data sets, information that tends to get overlooked in general discussion about such regimes. And though today's podcast is going to be based around an article that Joseph wrote entitled The North Korean Autocracy in Comparative Perspective, I do make a conscious effort to smuggle in a lot of his other research and questions that have clear relevance towards the North Korean situation, even if they are done so in pure theoretical terms. This information that I get Joseph to elaborate on at different moments in this podcast involve topics such as coups, democratisation, autocratic breakdown, foreign aid, economic growth, and human rights prosecutions, all with a look in on how they affect the autocratic regimes that they are targeting or involved with. Now, in many ways, North Korea breaks new ground when it comes to the study of dictatorship. They are an incredibly long-lasting regime, and a regime that has now handed on power along family lineages on 2 separate occasions, and a regime that is highly personalized, and this is a key aspect of Joseph's study into North Korea. He analyzes North Korea through this frame, and begins to show the nature of the regime, the nature of the autocratic structure in this way, how this managed to build up over time, and how it has strengthened the hand of the Kim dynasty. When Kim Il-sung first came to power, he did so on the backs of 2 foreign powers, the Soviet Union and China. Both, of course, had similar interests in the Korean Peninsula and also competing interests as well. And by sitting in between these 2 powers, Kim Il-sung managed in many ways to play them off against each other, to undertake purges, for example, of either side's men in Pyongyang, and still managed to keep these backers at bay and largely happy despite this. They didn't want to lose influence in Korea, and they didn't want to destabilize the peninsula. And of course, as this implies, Kim Il-sung came into a highly factionalized environment. And although this of course presents a lot of unique challenges, it also offered a new way forward. Kim was building a country up from scratch. He needed to rebuild the military, rebuild the political institutions. And he managed to parlay this factionalism into his own cult of personality, his own personalistic dictatorship. Soon enough, he wrestles power from the military, and then he turns his eye and curbs the power of the political institutions. What is left inside North Korea is a country in many ways that is a one-man rule. Kim Il-sung is the ultimate decision maker, and all other bodies inside the country are a rubber stamp upon his decisions. And in coming to these conclusions and these understandings about North Korea and its regime, we're going to talk through a lot of these deep data sets that Joseph has created, and try as much as we can to really open up the issue and open up the much broader issue, the much broader discussion about autocratic regimes, their nature, their rise, their longevity, and their downfall. Now, I do have to make a slight apology at this point. The audio quality in this podcast is not great. There were some issues with the microphones and the phone line that we just couldn't overcome. But I do encourage you to bear with this because the content here is quite important and quite unique. And I've been told on good authority that after a while, the crackling phone line, the crackling microphone does begin to drown out, and you do get engrossed more in the storyteller narrative here. So please bear with it. And of course, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account or the PayPal account attached below. On that, and to talk us through the breakdown of the North Korean autocratic regime, this is Joseph Wright. Joseph Wright, welcome to the Career Now podcast.
Thanks for having me here.
Okay, so your research here is really in depth, and it's quite a unique aspect of research, especially when it comes to North Korea and autocratic regimes. So as a very early stepping off point, because a lot of what we're going to be going through here in this podcast is deep analytical data sets. So I might get you just to introduce your research, the broad strokes of your research, so people know where we're heading in this podcast.
Sure. Yeah. So I study dictatorships. These are political regimes where power does not alternate between different parties or different groups in power. Oftentimes, there are places where there aren't free and fair elections. And what I do is I collect data on pretty much every dictatorship in the post-World War II era around the globe. So we're talking about Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, East and Southeast Asia, and a little bit in Latin America today. So I look for broad patterns in the data sets that I create to see and to explore the factors that help explain why they endure, why they collapse, and what happens when they do collapse, what comes next. These are the kind of places where it's likely to be a new democracy, or these kinds of places that are simply, when one regime collapses, it's likely to lead to either a failed state or a new dictatorship. My own research involves looking at foreign factors or international factors, everything from foreign investment and foreign aid to how military support from foreign countries to the earnings from export of oil to foreign countries. All these foreign factors influence the survival of dictatorships.
And on that point about the survival of a dictatorship, the survival of an autocratic regime, one of the first stepping off points here, just before we just get a good picture, one of the first things that comes through from your research here is just the longevity of the North Korean regime. I have this graph in front of me from your own data here, and it seems to be quite unique in this regard, just how long it has managed to survive.
Yeah, so the North Korean dictatorship, current dictatorship, is one of the longest lasting of the 20th and 21st centuries, right up there with the dominant party regime that lasted in power for about 20 years in Mexico, the Communist Party regimes in Mongolia and the Soviet Union, and also the Communist Party regime in neighboring China. So North Korea is right up there with all of those regimes, and alongside China, one of the ones that still is in power today. What's relatively unique about the North Korean regime is of all of the regimes that I talked about, they all have a dominant party. They've all established mechanisms for leadership rotation, peaceful leadership rotation, and for the most part, one leader has not consolidated individual power, at least not to the same extent as it has occurred in the North Korean regime. And that's what makes the North Korean regime unique. Not that it's the most highly personalistic or closed regime, but that it has those characteristics and it's long-lasting. Historically, those kinds of regimes have not been the longest-lasting dictatorships.
So let's move into that point that you just mentioned there. This idea of your research comes through a lot here, that this is a personalized regime or personalistic regime. So you've done a lot of work looking at the previous ways in which North Korea has been analyzed, and there's a whole number of them here. We won't go through them all, but ideas like a Confucius hierarchy, a unique form of communist state, a rebel state in as far as the Kim Il-sung was a rebel leader. People that emphasize the political role, people talk about hybrid dominant states and things like this. But your research, at least in this particular article, has gone in a new direction. And you've focused in on the personalistic rule or the personalist rule. So why did you take this track?
Well, so the North Korean regime shares characteristics with other dictatorships in the world, in which, insofar as the leader of the regime, that is the individual at the apex of power, has very few organized groups in the government that can check the power of the leader. That is, the leader can make decisions about who he appoints to key positions in the government and in the regime, and key decisions about policy, so we call personnel and policy decisions. The leader has almost nearly unilateral control over those decisions. In other dictatorships, other organized groups, namely the military and the political party that supports the regime, those two groups oftentimes will have the ability to act as a constraint or a check on the leader. Personalized regimes, however, that's not the case. And so the North Korean regime, we argue, is similar to other regimes, Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq, to what we're seeing evolve in Venezuela today, what we've seen evolve in Russia today, even, where individual leaders have consolidated control over the regime and have few institutionalized and few collective organizations in the regime that can check their power. And the reason why we want to think about, or it's important to think about the North Korean regime this way, is that using systematic data, at least in from the 20th century, how we think about the regime, whether we think about the regime as having an individualized, personalized leader with lots of power, or if we think about it as an institutionalized regime where leaders rotate peacefully in and out of power, where organized groups can check and constrain the leader, how we think about the regime has implications for both foreign policy, in terms of how foreign policies are likely to affect outcomes in the dictatorships, and it has big implications for how dictatorships end, and what comes next when they do end. If I looked at the data that we have prior to the year 2000, right, so this is prior to the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, prior to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and prior to what I would call the U.S. invasion of, or at least military efforts to unseat Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. So prior to all, in 2011, prior to all those events, so not even looking at all of those events, if you'd asked me what would happen if a foreign power came in and wiped out the regimes in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in Libya, I would have said the end result after for a military power wiping out those regimes, the result was most likely to be either a failed state or a new dictatorship. Based on data prior to 2000 that we collected for prior to 2000, how personalized dictatorships tend to collapse. They tend to collapse in violent ways, and what comes next when they do collapse. That it is very difficult to establish new democracies and long-lasting democracies from a dictatorship that has been ruled in a very personalized manner.
And as a last point here, before we get into some of the really deep aspects of this, let's look at three things that you mentioned here, such that people know how you've gauged this particular metric, how you've come up with an idea of a personal score, because you have these three key indicators: the leadership dimension, the party dimension, and the military dimension. So just briefly walk us through those before we launch ourselves into the data and where it takes us.
Yeah, okay. So the leadership dimension is an attempt to understand how the leader was selected, what was the experience of the leader prior to being selected as a leader. So in the case of North Korea, the first regime leader Kim Il-sung had been a rebel leader, but in fact, just prior to that, he'd actually been sort of in exile, if you will, after his faction had been defeated, and then he was sort of brought in by the Soviets. So it's trying to understand that. His subsequent leaders, that is his two children, were both selected precisely because they were his children, not because they had worked their way up through the military, not because they were the heads of the party. Indeed, they did have high positions in the regime, but that was simply because of their personal connection or their family relationship to the leader. So that's trying to capture that is how do you select a leader, and then also what does the leader do once he's in office? How do you get to have a position in high office in the regime? And does that depend on whether you have personal loyalty to the leader or some other meritocratic feature? And so when it's highly personal, based on loyalty or based on family connections, then we claim that's an indication of the regime being more personalized. The party dimensions and the military dimensions are a little bit more theoretically informed insofar as they're looking at two organizations, that is, the political party and the military, that have the capacity in many dictatorships to work collectively together to constrain the leader. And the reason they can do that is they can credibly oust the leader. And when the leader knows that his position in power is dependent on an organized group within the regime, then he has to listen to them. He has to consult them, and they can bargain back and forth when it comes to policy choices. And so the idea here is to try to capture indicators that would suggest to us that the party is in fact not able to act in a way that can collectively constrain or threaten the leader with removal. And so a good example of this would be one indicator that we think shows whether or not the party has more power or the leader has more power is whether the party selected the leader or the leader created the party. That is, you can think about in many democracies, in in South Korea, for example, and in the United States, where oftentimes the parties select their candidates for election, and then the candidate wins the election, and then is in power. And that's different than sort of coming to power, whether it be an election or a coup or some other way, and then creating your party after you've been in power. And so the key there is trying to understand whether or not you created a new party for your own political purposes, where we think you have more control over it, or whether the party actually selected the individual leader into power, in which case the leader would have less power. Then we look at things of whether or not the party simply acts as a rubber stamp, or whether the individual leader has control over selection into the party executive committee. In a dictatorship like North Korea, which was initially set up to be a Leninist type of regime, where the party has lots of control. That was the way it was intended to be set up with the Soviet model. The leader is not necessarily supposed to have unilateral power to select members of the executive committee. And the executive committee is supposed to be an organ that has the ability to act collectively to oust the leader, and the leader has to bargain with that committee. It's supposed to be a check on that power. And that's not the case in North Korea, so it's highly personalized. The North Korean legislature, or the party, acts as a rubber stamp. And oftentimes, whether the leader rules, sort of circumvents the party and legislatures and just rules the plebiscite. The military dimension is to look at whether or not the leader has control over the security apparatus, whether the leader has control over military promotions. So in a professionalized military, the leader of the country does not reach in and pull a lieutenant out and make him the commander of the military. Rather, the military decides how people rise through the ranks and are promoted within the military, and only at the very top positions are the selection of military commanders, senior officers, are they ratified by the leader. And that's very different than sort of mingling in the promotion patterns, even at the low officer elements. So the leader, when they does that, has more power. When the military has the power over promotions, then the military has more power. Similarly, if the leader creates a paramilitary organization outside the structure of the normal command of the military, that's a good indication that the leader is actually able to use the paramilitary as sort of a buffer or a shield against the military, and so that he can actually go in and do things to the military, interfere in their promotion practices, for example, with less fear of a coup from the military, precisely because he's got another armed organization that's not under the control of the military, namely a paramilitary organization. So again, in the case of North Korea, we find evidence of this being created relatively early on in the regime. So the leadership dimension and the party dimension and the military dimension are all meant to capture slightly different aspects of having personalized rule. And importantly, the party and the military dimensions are supposed to help us understand the extent to which the leader has power over these organized groups that have the potential, in some cases, to constrain the leader. In the North Korean case, we argue this isn't happening.
Now, that's a very useful framework there. And as we go through this podcast, hopefully we can fill in all those gaps that you mentioned. There's a lot more here. And one of the things that does come through, at least in these early stages of your research into North Korea, is a comparison that you run between Vietnam, China, and North Korea. And you put a lot of these indicators into a graph. And for anyone, I will link this to the bottom of this podcast so people can look for themselves. China's personalism index peaks at Mao, and then after Mao's death, it falls off the charts. Vietnam doesn't quite have that sort of structure, but when the war with America kicks in, it does get a more of a personalism structure around it. But North Korea's is quite unique. It rises quite abruptly and stays almost flat all the way across. It's had different kind of structure. So let's walk us through that for a second. How was it the case that China and Vietnam struggled to keep a personalism index, if that's something that they desired at all in the first place? And how have North Korea in some ways managed to kick this trend and managed to keep this going?
Well, so the key actually, I think, is the Chinese and the Vietnamese regimes were actually set up differently. They truly were guerrilla armies, insofar as that became political parties and then dictatorships. And so even when they were in their stated as basically insurgent armies, they had mechanisms for Mao, for example, still had to sort of listen to the executive committee early on in his rule. And it was only during the Cultural Revolution that he was able to begin to consolidate his own rule at the expense of the party and the military. And then with his death, the party is able to reassert its control over the regime, and he's not able to. After the Gang of Four is displaced, he's Mao, basically isn't able to choose his own successor. The party sort of bites back at that point. One of the key pieces that we find in the Chinese case is actually that the party, even before Mao's death in 1973, had started to re-exert control over Mao in terms of they'd be able to reestablish some key positions within the party that the occupiers of those positions were able to challenge Mao. And at various points, he actually he picked a successor and then had to sort of rescind his pick. That happened at least once in the 1970s. In the case of Vietnam, there's a rise of personalism during the war, and then right after the war, there's a rise of personalism, and that's in part due to the fact that the regime leader in that case is able to purge the Chinese faction that was that within the Vietnamese Communist Party, and that it shows less power for the party. That's an indication of less power for the party relative to the leader. Nonetheless, he's never able to fully consolidate power, and then basically the collective leadership of the regime is able to reassert itself after his death. In the North Korean case, there's very early indications that the regime leader, and this is the sort of the sequence that we find in our own historical research, is that Kim Il-sung was effectively able to take early control of the military and the security apparatus, in part because, unlike a rebel army, he was actually putting together a new army from scratch. And he was doing so when there were foreign troops occupying his territory, and such that he didn't actually need his own military to defend his own borders. Early on, he relied on the Soviets, and then after the war with the South and the UN and the US started, he began basically relied on the PLA, on the Chinese troops, to support him, and they remained in North Korea through the mid 1950s. So during this early period of regime consolidation, he always had a foreign power military stationed in his territory to help defend the borders, and that allowed him to do things within the military to consolidate personal power over the military. And then it wasn't until the 1960s that he's able to consolidate power over the Korean Workers' Party. In part, we argue because he had power over the security apparatus and had done things to cement his personal control over things like promotions in the Korean Army.
So you mentioned there this idea that there are foreign patrons, and there's two large foreign patrons here, China and the Soviet Union. And this is important, at least early on, because we're talking through how did Kim Il-sung manage to personalize power so quickly. And one of the things that you mentioned here is internal factionalism. And this runs through a lot of this, of course. This is very important. And you mentioned that there are three key factions here. One is this sort of this Manchurian army. This is the Soviet-backed Manchurian army. This is where Kim Il-sung comes from. His guerrilla forces, the people who he sees in some ways as being loyal to him. And there's a second faction in this regard that are from China. A huge number of Koreans are based in China during the Korean War, but also prior to that, during the Second World War, they are there fighting with Mao. And there's a third group, which is a Soviet faction comprised largely of Soviet officials of Korean descent who are then brought back into the country. And Kim Il-sung is stuck, though he is put in power pretty early on, but he has to deal with this factionalization. And you argue that this is a good thing for him in some ways.
Yeah, so all dictatorships have factions within them. The question is how well organized the factions are, and do they have the power to coordinate with each other to oust the leader? If they have that power, then they can effectively bargain with the leader, and the leader has to sort of listen to them, and so personnel and policy decisions are made jointly rather than just unilaterally by the leader. In the North Korean case, we argue that the high number of factions and the fact that these factions do not actually have, if you think about it this way, is the three opposing factions, if you will, the non-Manchurian factions. There was actually a domestic faction of Koreans who had been sort of the domestic Korean communists during World War II and during the Japanese occupation. So that group, their main language would have been Korean. The Koreans that were in China were in the PLA during the fight against the Japanese during World War II. They would have spoken not just Korean but also Mandarin. And the Soviet faction that was based in the Soviet Union, they actually were mostly fluent in Russian. And so actually the ability, not only do they have different prior experiences based whether in Korea, in China, and in the Soviet Union during World War II, so from the 1920s, 1930s, early 1940s, these groups are in very different places and oftentimes speaking different languages. And so their ability to coordinate against Kim Il-sung early on is almost non-existent. And so when there's multiple factions and they don't have the ability to effectively coordinate with each other to be able to credibly threaten the leader, then the leader is actually going to have ample opportunity to grab power from them. And so we see this at various points, both within the military and then again within the party. In the military, in fact, it's largely the Yan'an faction of the faction that had been in the PLA that is the biggest threat to Kim early on. And the reason for that is because they're simply the other armed group that eventually they're incorporated. Most of them are incorporated into the Kim Il-sung's nascent army in the late 1940s. But early on, they are his biggest threat. And what we see in the early stages of the war, what we call it the Korean War, or the war against the South and the UN and the US. In that war, Kim Il-sung's forces advance on the South and make great progress in terms of controlling territory in the South, and then there's pushback by UN, mainly U.S. forces, pushing back north of the current border, at which point the PLA basically comes to save the Kim regime. And without PLA participation in the conflict in the latter half of, or really, I think it's September through November, maybe even October, when they first entered 1950, they, without their participation, fighting against the U.S. and UN forces, the North Korean regime would have likely fallen. So they definitely came to save Kim. On the flip side, Kim was not willing to allow the main leader of the Yan'an faction, the most senior military commander of the Yan'an faction, who was fighting in his forces, was not allowing him to communicate with the PLA forces, initially. And the reason for that, we think, is precisely because Kim did not want a faction of his own military and the PLA to coordinate together to be able to oust Kim. And so Kim doesn't actually allow joint command structure of the Korean and the PLA forces until after he's purged the senior leader from the Yan'an faction. And so that's one of our first key indicators of personalization. And yes, he has to call a special session or plenary session of the party in order to conduct this purge. Once the purge is complete, then he's able to allow his military, his commanders in the military, many of whom are now leading Koreans who have strong connections to the PLA, to coordinate with the PLA in late 1950 and early 1951 to then repel the U.S.-led advancement and regain territory, regain Pyongyang during that period.
And of course, and sorry, I'll just jump in. An obvious question, just when that's tingling in my head as you're saying that, is why did China allow this purge to happen? Because this of course, is their faction, and there's links back to China. And I think you may have touched on it earlier, this idea that there's two patrons, Soviet Union and China. And they are, I think it comes through quite strongly here. It says groups like the Yan'an faction were purged and were able to be purged because North Korea was able to play this position between the two patrons. So neither one really wanted to upset the other by imposing themselves too much over the Kim regime.
Yeah. So this is happening in the initial purge is happening in late 1950, and this is just 2 years after the Soviet troops had left. And ultimately, the Kim regime was still reliant on the Soviet regime for military supplies, and ultimately was still going to, I would contend, still had the veto power over leadership selection for the North Korean regime at that time. And Stalin had said, at least the accounts that I have read indicate that Stalin had told Kim when he had planned to invade the South, that Stalin wouldn't contribute any troops. He was too worried about what was happening on on the other front, the European front, and so it was left to the PLA. But nonetheless, Stalin still wanted his puppet in power, and not a Chinese a leader who had strong affiliations with the Chinese and the PLA in power. And so ultimately, they are still the regional hegemon. While the PLA is the dominant post-1948, they're the ones that have they're the foreign patron that has the troops in the North Korean territory. The regime is still reliant on the Soviet Union, and indeed the war effort in the early 1950s was still highly reliant on Soviet material and aid. And so they still have that ability to effectively veto personnel or leadership selection, is what we would contend. And that's really the key here in this case, and what maybe makes it a potentially relatively unique case insofar as they had multiple patrons, foreign patrons, that both had veto power. What happened would actually allow the domestic leader, or the incumbent in this case, Kim, to consolidate power, even at the expense of factions associated with each foreign patron.
And this will be a slightly strange diversion here, but I do need to bring it in. There's a couple of aspects of research throughout your work, and that are in various other parts of work here, that I'd love to bring into this discussion. So let's bring something in here that you've done a lot of work on. It doesn't relate just to that, but you mentioned China and aid, so it's got a very tenuous link. So let's drag it in here. This idea of foreign aid, democratization, and growth. So in a number of articles, let's go foreign aid and democratization. First, you do a number of long looks at this issue, and of course, this is one of those ideas that if you contribute aid to a country, you may be able to help them democratize. But there's a whole lot of other data out there that shows that if a dictator is receiving aid, then they may just survive in power for a lot longer. They'll be propped up by this aid, so to speak. So talk us through briefly, give us a good view of that, this wonderful, this sort of complex data between democratization and aid.
Yeah, so the common view, which I think there's very powerful logic for this, is actually is negative, insofar as foreign aid, as you said, should actually help prop up dictatorships. That is, the government should take the money and use it to basically stay in power, whether that's paying the military, to pay off domestic groups that might be a threat to the regime. Nonetheless, it will keep the regime in power. Could be used for corrupt purposes, again, to help keep or placate some elites, to keep them from mobilizing against the regime. All mechanisms that point towards aid actually undermining democracy and, in fact, keeping dictatorships in power. So I was very interested in this question when I was writing my dissertation a decade ago, and I knew that not all dictatorships are the same. And so the basic story, when I started to investigate the data, is the following, and that is, there is a sweet spot, it appears, in the data in the 1990s when some types of when Western aid donors were providing substantial amounts of aid to some dictatorships, they were able to credibly threaten those dictatorships with withdrawing the aid unless those dictatorships held multi-party elections. The dictatorships that said, hey, let's keep the aid and have a multi-party election were actually the dictatorships that had institutionalized parties, is what I find. And these are political parties where they have repeated elections even under dictatorships. So a good example of this would have been in East Africa, in Kenya and Tanzania, for example, where they've got repeated elections, even some leadership turnover within the dictatorship. And so the regime had a long history of actually winning elections, in part by paying off large sections of voters, large groups of voters, with patronage at election time. And when dictatorships have a history of doing that, they actually have some credible electoral support if they have a genuinely fair and free multi-party election. And so when that happens, they can actually win some power. And so the trade of aid for multi-party elections doesn't look so bad. In a highly closed regime, though, that has never had elections before, and where the dictatorship and the elites in the dictatorship really have no good party organization such that they could actually effectively compete in a fair and free multi-party election. When that's the case, then the trade of aid for a multi-party election doesn't look so good. And so they're actually, it's not going to work in those contexts. That is, aid conditionality is not going to work in those kind of situations. And I think the key point of that is that Western donors have to care about democracy and want to have democratization in the aid recipient countries. And secondly, they have to be able to credibly withdraw the foreign aid. They're only willing to withdraw the foreign aid if the recipient of that aid is not strategically important. So the United States, for example, a large Western donor, is unwilling to withdraw its aid from a country like, say, Egypt, because they view that Egypt is strategically important. Yeah, so the story is that in the 1990s, I think that during the Cold War, the United States and other Western donors were reluctant to withdraw aid because they were afraid that the Soviet Union and Soviet bloc countries would move in with their aid. That is, they're both vying in some ways to retain client states. In the 1990s, though, that pressure obviously diminished, and Western donors were actually willing to put aid sanctions on dictatorships that were not willing to comply with their vision of multi-party elections and democratization. So a good example of that is actually in Malawi. United States and other donors put aid sanctions on the leader until he held multi-party elections, which he ended up losing. So that was a case where I think donors had a big influence in promoting, or had an effect in promoting multi-party elections. But the 1990s may have been a sweet spot, and the reason was because the United States was clearly a hegemon during that period, and Western donors did not have rival donors. If we think of the Soviet Union and Soviet bloc countries as rival donors during the Cold War, and then China in the 2000s and 2010s as a rival donor, then that logic that I just laid out actually becomes much less compelling, because Western donors are less willing to withdraw foreign aid for fear that other groups, that another large foreign aid donor might move in and basically capture a client state. And so that to me points to the limits of foreign aid being able to actually sort of buy democratization.
So that's a very interesting insight here, because, of course, a lot of the talk on the Korean Peninsula at the moment, of course, is about sunshine policies and outreach, and the idea that North Korea needs aid before they're going to, and people are hoping that this will be a step towards a more normalized regime in North Korea. But there's also another aspect of foreign aid, and of course this one, many people might be a bit more familiar with this one, comes a lot through your research, and that is this link between foreign aid and growth, which also has I suppose a questionable relationship. There are critics on both sides that argue about it, and you produce a lot of research too. So, and of course this is something that people talk about a lot. South Korean government are trying in many ways to bypass, at least get exemptions to bypass UN sanctions and contribute aid to North Korea, reopen case-like industrial projects and things like this. So talk us through this link between aid and growth, or this and how this manifests itself, or how it doesn't manifest itself.
Yeah, so in looking at non-democratic regimes or dictatorships, the research that I've done, the argument that I make in this research is the following. That is, if you give aid to in the hopes of promoting growth, a lot depends upon the incentives of the recipient of that aid, that is the government or the leader of that government. What are their incentives for growth? And so, if you think of aid as an investment in long-term growth, in building state capacity, in creating markets that are going to or investment sort of as an investment that has potentially a long-term a growth impact, then what matters actually is how long that dictatorship thinks he's going to be in power. And so for regimes with what we call a long time horizon, or think they're going to be in power for a long time, then aid actually can have a positive effect because a positive effect on growth, because the leader has an incentive to use that aid to actually promote growth, if that growth is in fact helpful to the regime staying in power. And indeed, we oftentimes think of economic growth as good for dictatorship staying in power, in part because it prevents mobilization based on economic grievances, negative economic shocks, prevents mobilization against the regime. So if the leader thinks he's going to be in power for a long time, or the regime thinks they're going to be in power for a long time, then they have an incentive to invest the aid, use it well. However, if they think they're not going to be in power for a long time, maybe because they face a domestic threat, then they will sort of use it unwisely and basically spend it all on retaining power rather than investing in it sort of for future growth.
And you mentioned here, let's get back to Kim Il-sung for a second, and this, I suppose, this strange sort of fraught moment in 1956, and this challenge between Yanang factions and Soviet factions that come up. And this is an important part in your research here. And this is these moments where Kim, I suppose, survives in many ways and also strengthens his hand. That in some ways, there's opposition forces, and as Kim is being not pushed out, but invited out to the Soviet Union, trying to be moved out, there is this rise against him in some ways. And he responds, he stays, and he purges a lot of people in power, though at the same time promising the Soviets and the Chinese that he will stop the purges. And you talk at some point in your research here about the purge indicator and just how this plays about here. So let's take us there for a moment, and this idea of purging enemies, and how successful Kim Il-sung is in doing that, in building up his personalist rule.
Yeah, so that's actually thinking a little bit about how he's able to do it within the party. This is a Leninist party where different factions have the ability to, up to this point, exert their control in part through the party congresses and through the party executive committee. And so he goes about trying to basically grab control of the party from various leaders of different factions. And this is going to actually, the foreign patrons are not exactly pleased with this, and so they are they're worried about this. But nonetheless, he's ultimately successful in it. And again, I think that comes back to the fact that he's got two foreign patrons. So he is able to sort of do all the. I mean, in light of what we see in the last couple of decades from the North Korean regime, this is not at all surprising. But sort of saying yes, I will to foreign patrons, and then in fact doing quite the opposite. Part of that has to do with the timing of it and the ability of the foreign patrons to enforce. If in fact they don't want that, they want the purges to stop, let's say, and Kim goes to visit them and says, "Hey, I'm going to have them stop," but then he returns home. What leverage actually at that point do the foreign patrons, the Soviet Union and China at that point? What mechanisms do they have to actually stop him from purging? And the question then becomes, if they have these mechanisms, if they have the leverage to stop that is, could they withdraw aid? Could they invade? Could they try to instigate a coup? All of these things would actually destabilize the regime. And so the question then becomes for the foreign patron, do they want to risk destabilizing the regime to get their preferred leader or the preferred behavior out of the current leader? Are they willing to risk destabilizing the regime, or do they prefer a stable regime to whatever shenanigans the current leader is doing? And ultimately, we argue that they side particularly the Soviet side are in favor of stabilization. And so we see that, I think, that argument in the contemporary period has been so often made about the Chinese government now in their relationship with North Korea, that indeed their primary concern is that the North Korean regime does not collapse. And so we just see sort of a similar problem happening in the 1950s here. So if you consider the Chinese regime currently as the North Korean sponsor or patron, if you will, there are plenty of things that I'm sure that the Communist Party elite do not like that goes on in North Korea. But then the question becomes, any mechanisms that they have to coerce the Kim regime, are they in fact worse off if that destabilizes the regime? So every time you attempt to punish the leader, does that in fact make him unstable and therefore lead to things that are actually make the foreign patron worse off?
And that's a great point to bring in another aspect, I suppose, side aspect of research, at least to this North Korean issue, but something you spend a lot of time working on. And that is for people who, I suppose, today they do it a lot, and people that look back, I suppose, through history and moments like that Yan'an purge in 1956 and things like this, and look back wistfully and think perhaps coup and regime change by uprising is a way to change the regime for the better, for a democratization or for a more liberalized regime. And you've done an awful lot of research into this area of coups for democratization, coups for more openness inside society. And once again, there are arguments on both sides about what happens here. But towards the end of this research, you have this line, and you begin to say that whenever there is a coup, and a coup inside a country, even if it's for the stated aims of democratization, it's more likely than not going to bring about another dictatorship and another autocratic regime.
Yeah, so historically that's been the case. And so a lot of coups are actually a mechanism for elites within dictatorships, particularly when the dictatorship is ruled by a junta or a group of senior military officers. Coups are, in fact, a mechanism for them to rotate leadership amongst themselves. So they get upset with the leadership of one commanding officer, and then they basically have a coup against him, or what we call a coup, and replace him with another senior officer. So historically, there are a lot of coups that are like that. But even in coups where a group of officers decide to try to displace the entire regime, that is actually quite rare that is successful in breeding a new democracy. And the instances where it does happen have almost been entirely mostly in the post-1990 period. And the key piece to understand about when coups could potentially lead to democracy actually has to do with foreign aid. And so we see that when Western donors see a coup in a country, that coup is most likely to lead to democracy when the Western donors say, hey, we're going to withdraw all our aid unless you have a multi-party election real quick afterwards. So it tends to be countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, that are highly dependent on Western foreign aid, that they have a coup. Western donors don't see them as particularly strategically important, and so are willing to incredibly threaten to withdraw the aid. That then the military leaders that led the coup say, hey, we'll have a multi-party election quickly. And so those are the instances where we actually see coups lead to democracy, and that's actually not what is likely to happen in countries where that are sanctioned by Western governments. In fact, countries that are currently under sanctions are not the countries that are receiving massive amounts of Western foreign aid. So, two good examples in the current period would be North Korea and Iran, two countries that Western governments have put economic sanctions on. They are not giving substantial amounts of foreign aid to these countries, and so therefore they have no leverage to sort of say, hey, if there was a coup, we're going to withdraw our foreign aid unless you have a multi-party election. So that mechanism of sort of producing a democratizing coup that we see play out in other parts of the world in the 1990s and the 2000s is just not likely to happen in a place like North Korea or Iran.
And another aspect of this, and of course, North Korea, this is one of those things that when the world is not talking about North Korea in terms of nuclear weapons and missile launches, they're talking about North Korea in terms of human rights. And another aspect here that comes up a lot is the idea that of human rights prosecutions. And of course, there was this famous UN panel, this UN commission a few years back that produced a large-scale human rights report against North Korea, charging them with crimes against humanity. And there is a lot of discussion out there, and you've done a lot of research as well, talking about the potential benefits, the potential downsides of what at least the looming specter of human rights prosecutions will do for a dictator in charge or a dictator that is trying to leave. And a lot of this brings in the idea of personalist dictatorships and how likely it is for someone who runs a personalist dictatorship, just like North Korea is now, how likely it is for someone like that to leave, and how damaging the specter of human rights prosecutions, as bad as that sounds, may be for someone like Kim Jong-un to ever leave power peacefully one day.
Yeah. So that's a really important point with big foreign policy implications. So, human rights prosecutions that really started to rise on the international scene in the 1980s, late 1970s, early 1980s, and then really increased in the 1990s and 2000s. That can actually be an effective foreign policy tool. But for that to work, for the human rights prosecutions and the threat of that possibility to work, not only do they have to be credible, which I think they can be, but there's an argument, a strong argument, for why they would actually potentially backfire. And the argument goes like this, is that if you basically threaten somebody with severe punishment if they step down peacefully, then they're less likely to step down peacefully. And this argument was first sort of thought about in the context of civil war. That is, if you're in the midst of civil war and you bring human rights prosecutions to one party in that war, or maybe both, but anyway, one party in that war, they actually have a stronger incentive now to continue fighting than they might have negotiated peace. But because they face the prospect of prosecutions if they have peace, then it actually gives them an incentive to continue fighting. In the context of a dictatorship that's not a civil war, the same logic might be applied, that the dictator actually has an incentive if he's hit with human rights prosecutions, international human rights prosecutions, that this is going to actually provide him with an incentive to actually remain in power, to never step down peacefully. And that even when other forms of foreign coercion, let's say economic sanctions, might actually push the leader to negotiate peaceful exit, he's actually less likely to do that if he faces the prospects of prosecutions. So, being a good liberal, I think that human rights prosecutions are generally a good thing. But I wanted to see if this argument or the counter argument about how they could backfire, co-author of mine and I wanted to see whether or not this logic was borne out in the data. And so we looked at this systematically. What we found is that the logic of the human rights proponents is generally, we find that logic bears out in the evidence, except in one class of dictatorships, and that's these personalistic dictatorships. The argument we make is the following, is that in personalistic dictatorships, these regimes have hollowed out the very political institutions, political parties, legislative institutions, the electoral apparatus, these institutions that have the possibility of actually helping protect these leaders from power, from prosecutions, if there's a transition to democracy. Oh, there's a good example from the Arab Spring uprisings in 2011. If you compare, for example, the case of Tunisia with the case of Libya. In the Tunisian case, the military was not highly personalized. That is, the senior commanders in the military, their careers were not tied to their loyalty to Ben Ali, the president of the Tunisian regime at the time. In fact, they had risen up through the ranks, and they were quite independent from him. When he gave the order to shoot protesters in 2011 in Tunisia, the military was able to refuse his command and not shoot, in part because the military knew that their interests could be preserved even under a new democracy. And sure enough, 2 years later, the senior commander in the Tunisian case actually was able to retire peacefully from the military with honors and didn't ever have any human rights prosecutions leveled at him. Further, many of the party elite that had backed the Ben Ali regime, the political party that backed him, they were able to basically reincarnate themselves in a political party, Anala, and re-win power. And so in regimes where these institutions, like a political party that backs the dictatorship or the military that backs the dictatorship, when they're able to not be hollowed out, when they're not personalized, they actually are able to exert power in a post-transition or in a transition after a transition to democracy. They're able to exert some power. As a result, they're actually able to protect their interests. They're able to win power in the legislature to block legislation that might have actually led to prosecutions. But in a highly personalistic dictatorship, however, where there's either not a political party, like in the case of Libya, where that political party has been completely hollowed out with just those people are not able to win power in a transition to democracy. So if there is a transition, those groups are unable to protect the leader from prosecutions precisely because they lack the capacity to sort of win power fairly if there were to be a new democracy. And so you see this with respect to Gaddafi, which is also a highly personalized regime in Libya, is that there were rumors that he was actually seeking an exile agreement to leave power peacefully, and then he was actually hit with not with prosecutions, but with an indictment from the ICC. And then that actually gave him an incentive to double down and continue fighting until what led to his bloody death and the downfall of his regime. And I think that was in part why exile agreement never worked out in that case, was in part because the elites that supported his regime had no way to protect their own interests, and therefore encouraged him to keep fighting, particularly after they were hit with human rights prosecutions. So I think in a case like North Korea, human rights prosecutions, while it's important to bring that stuff to the light of day, and oftentimes it can have positive effects. I think in other contexts, but I think oftentimes it can have a positive effect on the anti-regime mobilization when there's a foreign signal that there are foreigners out there that support the opposition, the mobilized opposition. That can actually be helpful. But in the North Korean regime, I see they're unlikely to. It's more likely to backfire than to actually be helpful in an instance like that.
So let's wind this back to North Korea here, and I suppose to put in a bow on some of the things that we've been talking about here. We mentioned it through your study of North Korea, and it talks about the initial factionalization, the multiple foreign backers, China and Soviet Union, the Kim wrestling power from the military, and then turning his gaze to the Korean Workers' Party himself, and this building up of this personalism. And what comes through to me here is the durability of it all. So what seems to be the case is that these are all initial conditions. These are things that happened very early on in the dictatorship. And since the first Kim created that, he's handed over power in 1994 to his son, and now his grandson has power since 2012, and it continues. And one of the remarkable things that I'm not sure if I'm misreading this, that does come through from your research here, is that these initial conditions set up an awful lot of the reasons for this durability.
Yeah, I think that's correct. The one of the ways that personalism can quickly sort of increase is once you grab a little bit of power from the institutions that have the ability to constrain you, further attempts to grab the power are more likely to succeed. That is, the weaker your opponents get, the more likely you are to win the next battle you have against them. Here, the opponents being the organized groups, domestic groups. And so it's what we call an endogenous process. A little bit of personalization actually leads to more personalization tomorrow, which leads to more and more and more. And so it sort of keeps increasing. Where these things fall apart is when leaders die. What was interesting and potentially relatively unique about the North Korean case is that you talked about him dying in 1994 and the son transitioning to power at that point. But in fact, he was named as a successor in the mid-1970s. And so there was a solid 20 years for other elites in the North Korean regime to sort of coalesce on a new regime leader. And so that transition was, while it may have appeared abrupt in 1994 at Kim Il-sung's death, in fact, it was a gradual transition, giving ample time to other elites in power to coalesce on a new leader, that is his son, prior to the death of the regime founder. In other personalist dictatorships, that's just not the case. It's difficult to transfer power to your son without creating backlash, and for there to be many years, indeed decades, for that son to sort of be the named successor and gradually assert power. Interestingly enough, I think other dictators have noted this. Lukashenko he started to groom a teenage son into this position. And maybe there'll be decades in power. He'll be decades in power with his named successor of his son in an attempt to mimic what Kim Il-sung has done. But I do think it's relatively rare to have that kind of a transition from father to son, particularly one that's taken place over so many decades.
And while I have you here, as a final question, I can't let this go without asking this. Of course, as you mentioned, your research has been into autocratic regimes, how they rise, how they fall, and you've done so much deep analysis, deep data sets into this. And I suppose you said there just then that North Korea in many ways is unique. But a lot of what you do look at is under what circumstances is the ouster, the overthrow of a dictator likely, and change towards democratization likely. So your personal view on North Korea here, under what circumstances do you see this changing, or what do you think will need to happen based on your research of North Korea here?
Yeah, so the elite would need to lose their goodies. We've seen this, in the 1990s, where severe economic bad times in North Korea. But even then, the elites were still able to have their goodies. So the elites need to turn on the leader, and that's very, very difficult to do. To strike out the sources of revenue that the leader uses to sort of placate the elites. In the North Korean case, that would mean basically cutting off all of the international flow of revenue. And quite frankly, the question is, would China be willing to do that completely? I mean, effectively, not having a loose end to that flow of foreign revenue into the regime. So that's what it would take. Is really a complete stoppage of the foreign revenue. The other thing that could potentially work to undermine the regime is the death of the premature death of the regime leader before he's had the chance to sort of groom a successor, by which other elites are able to coalesce amongst. It's very difficult when there's a natural death of a leader, sort of prematurely, for the groups that support that leader to actually come to an agreement on a new leader, unless they've got that focal point in the old leader who's named a successor. So the premature death of Kim would actually be another way for this regime to collapse. Neither scenario, I think, is likely to breed a long-lasting democracy. But I've been wrong before, and I've been wrong in the past, and I probably will be wrong again sometime in the future. So for what that's worth.
Yes. Well, thanks for that. That was a great insight there, and I suppose a very interesting look forward. The article that I based a lot of my questions around today is entitled "The North Korean Autocracy in Comparative Perspective." But there's a whole series of other articles that are brought in, and I will link them below in this podcast as well. So on that, Joseph Wright, thanks for coming on the Korean Hour podcast.
Thanks. Yeah, it's great to be here.